Hi again then guys, and welcome to another specific car review, and even more specifically a Group 3 race car review for Gran Turismo Sport. And this is a vehicle which I actually won either yesterday or the day before, I can't recall, they all blend together. And at least of course in relation to the release of this video, that is the case. Now the car is the Honda NSX, the Group 3 version, as I said earlier. And this is a car which, to be honest, has a lot to live up to because of how good the road car already is. And of course we have discussed the road car on the channel, but the distinct advantage that the road-going N-class vehicles will always have, at least as far as I'm concerned, is primarily the sheer usability that they have. You can use them in so many more classes, at least with most of the road cars, than you can with a race car. That doesn't make the racing any better or any more or less competitive, of course, but it just means that you quite simply have the opportunity to use a road car in more categories of racing. In the case of something like the NSX, for instance, you can have it all the way down in the N400 class, but all the way up to N900. That's a massive range of potential. This one is, of course, as with all of the Group 3 cars, specifically within that category. And no matter how much or how little power and weight it has, that remains the same. So within that very strict world of this type of racing, with this kind of car, how does the NSX not only, of course, compare to its rivals, like GTRs specifically, but also others too, but also, how does it compare to the road car? Because of course, being a race car, it's going to be quicker around corners. You pretty much assume that. It is lighter. It's not as powerful, but it is lighter. It has a lot more downforce to be working with. It will already come with racing tyres, for instance, so you've already got these kind of advantages over a road car when it comes to track performance. However, at the same time, there are some notable differences which could make a race car, despite its advantages in terms of downforce and quality of the tyres, potentially still more difficult to drive, such as, for instance, the lack of an all-wheel drive hybrid system, which the road version has, making it, I would say, one of the best drift cars in GT Sport. It's by far my most used drift car. I've got well over 1 million drift points with the road-going NSX, and I used it to unlock that achievement in the game. This race car, it doesn't have that all-wheel drive. You've got to do much more of the work. So how does it compare? Well, in some ways, I would say it's surprisingly similar to the road car, because even though the road car does have that hybrid differentiation from this one, it still has a similar tendency to the road version in that the front end can sometimes be a little bit loose. And that's not really a problem that its main rival, the GTR, has. And it is a problem which some of the older Super GT NSXs have had on, for instance, Gran Turismo 6. And I talked about that at length in the Tour of Japan series, where I talked about all of the GT300 and GT500 cars. And one of the most common issues that I had with those Super GT NSXs was the fact that the mid-engine rear-wheel drive layout of them could sometimes give the car this strange feeling that the steering was almost pivoting from the centre of the car rather than from the front end. It gave it a very strange handling signature, which meant that especially in lower speed corners, the front end would have this tendency to run off on its own and turn in too much. Not to the point where it spins out or gets its tail out in a drift, but more so just in a very loose, overly light kind of way, which the road car just doesn't do because of the all-wheel drive. Now, this car still has that trait. It's far less challenging than I would say some of the Super GT NSXs were. They require very, very fine tuning, or at least that's what I found to be the case on Gran Turismo 6. This one, though, definitely still has that kind of feel. And if you haven't driven this one yet, as a point of reference, if you have driven this other one, I found it to be kind of similar to the Audi R8 LMS. And of course, if you haven't driven that won't be much of a help. But if you have, then this is, I would say, very similar to that. Not as challenging, but it has very similar handling characteristics, that mid-engine rear-wheel drive layout with a front end that can sometimes be a little bit too light. And one of the issues with a car that handles like that is that it's not that it's slow or that it can't keep up. In fact, to the contrary, it can often be very nimble through corners, But the problem is you can have a tendency to overcorrect that kind of handling, and that is usually, ironically enough, what can lead you to spinning out, or making mistakes, or clipping the grass, or even just going off the track completely. That overcorrecting of handling, which is nothing like a front-engine rear-wheel drive car would be, can lead to those issues sometimes. I would say that for the R8 LMS and for this car, that is kind of an issue, or at least it can be. And of course, stuff like tuning the diff and tuning the suspension can make a big difference to a car like this. The innate potential, though, is most definitely there, because the NSX is a brilliant performance car. The original, the facelift, this completely new NSX in road form, it's got a strong lineage, a very, very strong lineage, and this one definitely lives up to that potential. Now, in terms of its raw numbers, some of the numbers aren't quite as impressive as you might assume. The weight in particular is a little bit higher than quite a few of the other Group 3 cars to begin with, at 1,300 kilos. The power, though, is still pretty good, 568. The torque is also pretty decent at 430 pound-feet, and the price is, of course, 450 grand, like the vast majority, if not all, I think, of the GT3 cars. And in terms of horsepower per tonne, you're looking at 437. So across the board, it's certainly good enough in any particular way to be a threat, but not necessarily a dominating car in any particular way. There are definitely some which are dominating forces. Stuff like, for instance, the Mercedes AMG GT. That's a hugely powerful car, even to begin with. This one doesn't have that kind of daunting advantage, but at the same time, it's an NSX, so it would be very difficult for this to not be a competitive car. Now, personally, I found this to be a little bit slower than the Peugeot RCZ Group 3 machine around Suzuka. That car I found to be a very, very good handling machine. It felt a lot lighter than it was. I instantly loved it. This one, not so much in that way. I found this one to be the kind of car which requires a little bit more focus and a little bit more finesse, whereas the Peugeot, I would say, is a bit more forgiving. And the GTR is definitely a more forgiving car in both road and race form, because that's just what the GTR is like. But for the kind of person who wants to use an NSX, stick to using it, learn to use it correctly, learn to get around those little niggles that the handling can sometimes have, well then, yeah, you can definitely do really well with it, because it does have huge innate potential, and if you take advantage of that, yeah, you can definitely win races with it, of course. Any of the Group 3 cars have to have that kind of potential by definition, but there are definitely stronger ones, and I would say that this, for the right driver, especially for people who maybe fancy a little bit more of a challenge and don't want to be, not necessarily spoon-fed, but there are definitely some very forgiving cars. For those who don't necessarily want them to be forgiving, this is a good alternative. But that's it for this pick overall. I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.